You wake before the harbor stirs. The room is dim, the faint gray of pre-dawn pressed against the warped window panes. The air carries a steady dampness, a mix of salt from the sea and the heavier, lingering tang of whale oil. The blanket is rough wool, scratchy against your skin, and cool where it has slipped away from your shoulders in the night. You lie there for a few breaths, listening. Somewhere outside, you hear the uneven creak of a ship's rigging shifting with the tide, and the soft lap of water against the pilings. A gull calls once, far off, the sound thinned by the mist that rolls in thick at this hour. Your clothes from yesterday hang over the back of a chair. They smell faintly of bone dust, a scent not unpleasant if you have grown used to it, dry, chalky, and with a trace of something organic beneath. You pull them on slowly, the wool trousers holding the coolness of the night, the shirt smelling faintly of the stove smoke from the day before. The buttons are mismatched, replaced over the years with whatever could be spared from old garments. In the kitchen, you move quietly. The floorboards are soft with age, and each one bends slightly under your steps. A single mug waits on the table, the pewter dulled to a gray that matches the light outside. You pour a small measure of tea, steeped in water that never quite loses the tang of the wooden barrel it was drawn from. The warmth in your hands is almost enough to make you pause longer, but there's work to do. The tide and the sun will not wait for the slow hand. Stepping outside, you feel the cold at once. The air holds that peculiar sharpness of a harbor before dawn, when the water's surface seems to draw the warmth from your face. Your boots strike the damp gravel path that leads toward the water, and you notice how the stones shift slightly under your weight. The houses here are close together, though at this hour most are still dark. Only a few chimneys send out lazy threads of smoke, curling low before being pulled apart by the faint breeze. Down by the wharf, the larger ships loom like dark shapes in the mist. Their masts vanish upward into the pale gray, the rigging no more than faint lines. You know that by mid-morning, the harbor will be alive with shouts and the thud of crates on planks. But for now, it is as if the whole town is still half asleep, suspended in the hour between night and day. A few other early risers pass you on the path, men carrying coils of rope, a boy with a crate of fish heads for bait. Their greetings are brief, nods more than words, as if talking too loudly might wake the sea itself. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you recall that historians still argue whether most harbor towns in Newfoundland followed a strict curfew in the 19th century, or simply kept early hours out of necessity. Either way, you know your own work waits whether or not the rest of the harbor has stirred. As you near the workshop, the familiar smell deepens, salt, oil, and bone dust mingling into something you can recognize from a dozen paces away. You pause for a moment outside the door, feeling the dampness in the wood beneath your fingertips, listening to the muffled quiet inside. The day will be long, your hands sore, the work slow, but for now there is a certain stillness you almost hate to disturb. You follow the damp gravel path toward the shed, each step making a softened crunch that the fog quickly swallows. The stones underfoot are slick with dew, and a thin skin of moisture shines on the tufts of grass that push up between them. Mist curls around your boots, rises to the hem of your trousers, and leaves a fine chill along the fabric. The air smells clean in that harbor way salt, sap from sea-wet timber, and the faint metallic tang that always seems to come from iron nails in wet planks. Above you, gulls call in slow, spaced cries, as if the morning must be coaxed into motion, one note at a time. The houses thin as you near the water. Low sheds cluster in small knots, their roofs bowed with age, their shingles darkened by years of salt spray. Nets hang from pegs like heavy curtains. Coils of rope sit in patient spirals along the walls, and a broken oar leans in the corner where someone set it down months ago and never bothered to mend it. A dog steps out from under a cart, gives you one lazy glance, then settles back onto its paws, as if your passing is just a change in the weather. You keep to the path you know best, past the fish stage that juts out over the shallows, past the stacked barrels that smell of tar and pitch, past the patch of crushed shells that crackle faintly underfoot. Here the harbor speaks in small sounds, the hollow plop of a slow wave against a post, the gentle knock of a boat's side against its mooring, the sigh of wind through a torn piece of canvas. A skiff rocks, barely moving, tethered by a rope worn smooth where it rubs the ring. You glance at the water and find it the color of pewter, ruffled here and there by breathless swirls. In your pocket there is a folded scrap of cloth holding yesterday's filings, a habit you keep so they don't shift around the workshop floor. The cloth is stained and a little stiff where oil has soaked into it. You rub it once with your thumb as you walk, then let it go. The shed is close now, the one with the low door and the small square window that warps the world into wobbled panes of light. Its boards are gray as weathered bone. You could pick it out in a storm. That familiar lean, that peel of paint no one bothers to replace. You breathe in and taste the faint sweetness that comes from freshly planed whalebone, which is neither truly sweet nor exactly pleasant, but has its own dry perfume. A mainstream fact settles in your thoughts the way a tide mark sets on stone. In the 19th century, what people call whalebone in shops and ledgers is not bone at all, but baleen, the flexible plates from a whale's mouth that filter tiny life from seawater. Those plates, once cleaned and cut, become stays for corsets, ribs for parasols, frames for hand fans, even the stiffening pieces in bodices and bodice busks that keep their shape through seasons of wear. The world's fashions pull on the harbor's quiet mornings without ever raising their voices. The gulls go quiet for a moment, and you hear a human sound, someone humming inside a nearby loft. You recognize the tune, but not the singer. The note slides and finds its level, like brine seeping into wood. You step around a puddle and catch your face in it, briefly, all blur and gray. As you walk, a thought of small, ordinary oddity passes through the kind that edges a day with its own mild smile. A quirky tidbit. Some hands in town swear that rubbing a touch of seal oil into boot leather keeps the damp out better than any wax, and that the smell fades quicker than folks claim if you warm the boots by the stove. You have tried it, though not often. The scent lingers enough that you feel you are carrying the sea on your ankles hours after you've come indoors. The shed door resists, as it always does at first light. The wood swells in the fog and returns to itself only with steady persuasion. You could lift the latch without looking. The palm knows where the iron dips, where the edge catches. The hinges answer with a slow groan that is less complaint than custom. Within, the air is denser and warmer by a breath. Your eyes take a moment to adjust. Light filters through the small glass and falls in a rectangle across the workbench where your blades will wait, sour and silent, beneath their thin film of oil. You do not go straight to the bench. You stand a moment in the doorway and let the harbor's hush share the room. From here, you can see the fish flakes down the shore, their latticework platforms still empty in this season. The town's pulse is not hurried, it rarely is, but it is competent, routine, worn smooth by repetition. A thing worth noting, and one historians still argue over in quiet pages. Whether small workshops like this one took in baleen directly from local whaling crews, or whether most usable plates reached outports like this through merchants' hands from larger stations in distant ports. Records exist, yes, lists of cargoes and invoices, but gaps remain. Some days the ledger tells a full story, and some days it just turns a page without a word. You set your hand on the workbench. The wood has a shallow hollow where the heel of your palm rests when you draw a blade toward you. Chips of pale shaving sit like curled moon slivers along the edge. They catch the light in a way that pleases your eye even before the day begins. You rub your thumb over the bench's scar, counting the grooves as if they were notches in a quiet calendar. Today will add its own faint line to the collection. A cart goes by outside, wheel wobbling, the load muffled in cloth. The driver's voice drifts in, and the sound has the sleep-sticky quality of a morning not yet fully begun. He says something about a crate that needs to go to the merchant's house by supper. Then the voice fades into the fog as if it never belonged to a person, only to the hour. You picture the crate made ready, the lid fitted, the nails set true. You will likely see it later, destined for a shelf where someone will measure each piece, assign it a price, and write a tidy figure every bit as real as a tide. You lift the window latch to draw in more light. The pane sticks, then pops, and a cool breath slides into the room. Outside, the fog has lifted a finger width, giving the water a skin of pale brightness. You can make out the darker seam where the wharf begins. Two boys walk there with a length of plank between them, faces set in that careful seriousness of the very young when they are doing a task they believe to be important. They are important. Everyone is. In their small square of mourning. You place the day's tools in a neat line, the saw with its fine teeth, the narrow-bladed knife for delicate cuts, the file that will carry a soft, rasping song across the shed once it begins to bite. You press down on the file with your fingertips. Even through oil, you feel the subtle grit. Alongside them, a small tin of soot-streaked rag waits for later, for darkening incised lines when the polish would otherwise swallow them. You open the tin and close it again, like a promise. Before you begin, you stand one last time in the doorway. The gulls have found their voices again. A wedge of sound arrows across the water and splits gently on the shore. You lift your shoulders and let them fall. A day does not need to be decided all at once. It will decide itself in 100 patient touches, the weight of a slab set on the bench, the slide of a blade, the faint crunch of gravel when you step out for air. You take that first measured breath that marks the true start of work, and the harbor exhales with you, slow and even, as if it has been waiting for your pace to set the tone. You start with the piles. They sit in the dimmer back corner of the shed, stacked not by height or width, but by what they will become. Jawbones here, long and wide, still smelling faintly of the sea. Ribs there, their curve familiar, each one less dense, lighter in the hand but no less stubborn under the blade. The wood beneath the piles is stained from years of drips, oil, seawater, and the faint dust that falls as each piece is cut and shaped. The smell is its own map. Jawbones carrying the sharper scent, ribs the sweeter, almost like dried kelp if you have the nose for it. You step closer and rest a hand on the nearest plate. The surface feels smooth but not polished, like a board sanded once and left unfinished. Under the light from the small window, the color shifts between a pale ivory and a dull gray depending on the angle. You know from habit which ones will flex well for stays, which will yield the straight strips for parasol ribs, and which are best left for sturdier, less delicate work. The foreman appears in the doorway, a shadow against the brighter fog outside. His voice carries the steady weight of someone who has said the same words each morning for years. He nods toward the jawbones first, then to the ribs, his meaning clear without needing a list. Keep them separate, keep them in order, and don't let the plates warp before you're ready to cut. You nod back, the exchange no more dramatic than a tide turning. Some of the jawbones still hold faint impressions from where the baleen was cut free from the whale's mouth. The edges are fibrous in places, frayed strands hardened into wiry tufts. You run your thumb along one, feeling it catch slightly on the skin. A mainstream fact drifts into the moment. Newfoundland's 19th century whaling industry was not as large as those in New England or Greenland, but it was steady enough to supply small ports like this with the raw material for a variety of trades, from coopers to corset makers. Most ships hunted right in the North Atlantic, returning within weeks rather than months. As you work through the piles, setting jawbone to one side and ribs to another, you notice a curious thing about the ribs. Some hold an almost translucent edge at their thinnest points, enough that light catches through if held just so. The effect is brief, gone as soon as the bone shifts, but it's there. It reminds you of an old dockside tale, the quirky sort told by a retired carver who swore that in the deepest fog, if you held a rib plate up to the lantern, you could read through it like frosted glass. Of course, he never said what he was reading. The piles grow neater as the minutes pass. The dust under your boots thickens, a pale layer that coats the edges of your soles. Every so often you pause to knock the dust away on the beam near the door. The sound is muffled, more felt than heard. The light from the window strengthens a little, and with it the shapes of each plate become sharper, the fibers at the edges more distinct. You shift the last jawbone of the morning onto its stack. It's heavier than it looks, the weight uneven, forcing you to adjust your grip. The surface is cold enough to make your fingers ache for a moment, even through the callus that years of carving have built. You set it down with care. If it chips here, the loss will be more than the material it will be. The time it took to haul it, clean it, store it. As you straighten, your eyes pass over the far corner of the shed, where a half-forgotten piece leans against the wall. Its edges warped, bowed inwards in a curve too sharp for most uses. Perhaps it has been here a season, perhaps longer. Some say warping like that comes from storing the plates too near heat. Others blame the dampness from a leaky roof beam. Historians still argue whether storage techniques in small workshops followed a formal method at all, or whether carvers simply adapted to the quirks of their particular building. You suspect the latter. From outside comes the clatter of a cartwheel hitting a loose plank on the wharf. The sound snaps against the stillness of the shed, then fades into the background again. You wipe your palms on your trousers and take a slow step back, letting the pile settle in your sight. They are in order now, the kind of order that will make the rest of the day pass without pause or misstep. The foreman glances in once more, sees the neat stacks, and says nothing. Silence, in this case, is as good as praise. A faint draft slips in from the cracks between the boards. It carries a sharper salt smell, mixed with something you recognize as fish oil, probably from barrels being rolled somewhere nearby. You breathe it in without thought, letting it join the other layers of scent in the shed. There's a rhythm to mornings like this. The sorting, the arranging, the quiet, small movements that feel almost like setting a stage. Soon the real work will begin, and the tools will leave their marks. But for now, it's enough to have the materials ready, waiting, patient, in their own silent rows. You turn to the bench where the sharpening stone waits, resting in its shallow wooden trough. The stone is worn into a long, low valley from years of drawing steel across its surface. You set a small pitcher of water beside it, tipping just enough to wet the length of the stone. The first splash darkens the gray, and as it seeps into the grit, it brings out a faint smell of damp earth. Your fingers trail through the water for a moment before you lift the first blade. It's the long knife you use for initial shaping, narrow enough for curves, but solid enough to press through stubborn grain. You lay the edge against the stone at the angle you know by feel, not measure, and draw it toward you. The sound is soft and even, a quiet hiss that keeps its own pace. You dip the blade, wet the stone again, and repeat. The rhythm comes back as if it has been waiting all night. The workshop fills with that muted scrape, a sound that could put even your own thoughts to sleep if you let it. A strip of pale cloth lies folded beside you. Every few passes you wipe the blade along it, leaving a dark streak of steel dust. The cloth is already marked from months of this work, the stains overlapping until they make a pattern only you would notice a history of edges, faint as old tide lines. You take up the smaller carving knives next. They're short blades meant for finer details. These need a lighter hand, a quicker flick at the end of each stroke. Too much pressure here and the edge will wear unevenly. You imagine the blade like a drawn line, steady, without tremor, and the stone responds in kind. Outside, someone knocks a hammer against wood 3 times. The sound carries easily through the shed wall. In your mind, it matches the cadence of your strokes. You breathe in time with it. A mainstream fact passes through your thoughts. In 19th century Newfoundland, sharpening was not just maintenance but part of the morning ritual in most trades. The same for fishers mending nets, coopers fitting staves, and carvers preparing bone. A keen edge was more than efficiency. It was respect for the work and the material. You reach for the saw, its teeth dulled just enough to knead the file. Running your finger gently along the row, you feel the minuscule burrs left from yesterday's cuts. Setting the saw into the vise, you begin with the first tooth. The file sings a higher note than the stone, a dry rasp that lifts into the air and lingers before fading. You work tooth by tooth, patient, until the line is clean again. There's a quirky notion you recall from an older hand in the trade, that a blade sharpened in silence will keep its edge longer than one sharpened to conversation. He claimed the words carried off a fraction of the steel's strength. You don't believe it entirely, but you keep your own sharpening quiet all the same. Habit makes its own truth over time. Once the saw is done, you oil each blade lightly, letting the sheen settle along the steel. The oil catches what little sunlight has managed to seep through the warped window pane. The smell of it mixes with the bone dust in the air, making that familiar blend that will stay on your hands well past supper. You check the edge of the long knife with the pad of your thumb, brushing across rather than along it. The steel whispers back in the faintest bite against your skin. The sharpening is complete for now. You set each tool in its place on the bench, edges turned slightly inward, a habit learned after seeing one too many sleeves caught by accident. From the street outside, you hear a wagon roll past, wheels rattling over loose stones. Somewhere above the harbor, a bell rings once, not for the tide, not for the hour, but perhaps for some private signal among the fishermen. Historians still argue whether small ports kept a standardized system of bells in the 19th century, or if each cove and harbor worked out its own language of sound. Whatever the truth, you've learned to read the tones here without knowing exactly who they're meant for. The tools gleam faintly in the slanted light. You take the stone in your hands and tip it to empty the water into the trough. The grit feels smoother under your fingertips now. Satisfied, you set the stone aside and draw in a slow breath. The air in the shed is cooler than it will be come afternoon. The sort of cool that sharpens your own edges before the real labor begins. You flex your fingers once, twice, as if to test the readiness in your hands. The blades are waiting. The bone is waiting. The day has taken its first deliberate step forward. You choose the first piece without hurry. A slab cut from the edge of a jawbone, heavy enough that you feel its weight pull at your arm. Its surface is pale, with faint streaks the color of old parchment running lengthwise. Setting it on the bench, you wedge it against the stop block so it won't shift. The saw rests easily in your hand, teeth bright from the morning's sharpening. You tilt the slab slightly, finding the angle where the light shows every ripple and ridge you will need to cut through. The first stroke is slow. The teeth catch at the surface before sinking in, each movement releasing a soft, dry hiss as bone dust begins to lift into the air. The smell is immediate, not sharp, but earthy and faintly sweet, like the inside of a long-dried shell. You breathe through your nose and keep the saw steady, the rhythm even and unhurried. Dust settles on your sleeves, on the bench, on the narrow strip of floor where your boots stand. With each pass, the cut deepens, the sound softening as the saw rides smoother in the groove. A mainstream fact comes to mind. Baleen, though called whalebone, is softer and more fibrous than true bone, yet still dense enough to dull a blade if worked carelessly. Its structure allows for the combination of strength and flexibility that corset makers and umbrella frame fitters prized. You can feel that hidden flexibility as the slab shifts slightly under the saw's pressure. The bench creaks with the rhythm of your work, a small voice in the larger quiet of the shed. Outside, a gull calls once and is answered by another, the two notes overlapping before fading into the fog. You pause to brush away the growing mound of dust from the cut, the fine particles clinging to the small hairs on the back of your hand. The smell of it is stronger now, layered with the faint tang of the oil you rubbed into the saw's handle. You press on, the cut nearing its end. The saw teeth change pitch as they meet the final stretch, the resistance easing until the last fibers give way with a faint snap. You set the saw down and lift the slab's smaller section away, its fresh cut edge lighter in color, almost creamy. The contrast between cut and uncut surfaces always strikes you, one smooth and new, the other weathered by sea and storage. A quirky tidbit comes to you, one you once overheard from a ship's cooper. Some sailors believed the dust from cutting whalebone could keep rats away if sprinkled along the edge of a storeroom. You have no proof of it, though the smell alone might be enough to discourage a curious animal. Still, you've never tried it. The dust is too valuable here, sometimes used to polish the very pieces it comes from. You take the slab in both hands and turn it, judging which side will yield the straightest lines for the next cut. The fibers in baleen run lengthwise, and if you work against them, the edge will fray instead of staying clean. That knowledge sits in your hands more than in your thoughts now, the sort of skill that comes from repetition rather than study. Somewhere in the back of the shed, a drip of water falls into a metal bucket with a soft plink. You glance up to the roof beam, knowing there's a knot in the wood where rain has made its way through more than once. Historians still argue whether most small workshops in Newfoundland had deliberate drainage systems or simply let the damp seep where it would. In your own experience, the sea finds its way into everything eventually, no matter how you try to hold it back. You place the smaller section of bone to one side, where it will be planed later. The larger slab remains on the bench, ready for the next cut. Your hands feel the faint buzz left in them from the sawing, a quiet hum that lingers in the fingers. You brush the dust from your sleeves, though the fine powder clings stubbornly in the weave. The floor at your feet is already speckled with pale shavings, the first sign of a day's progress. Outside, the fog is thinning in places, showing the faint outline of masts against the sky. The harbor will be busier soon. For now, though, you turn back to the bench, lay your hand on the cool surface of the slab, and measure the next line in your mind before the saw bites in again. The work goes on, one cut at a time. You lay the smaller slab across the bench and turn it until the light finds it just right. The surface holds a faint, silky sheen, the kind that shows where the fibers run true. You fetch the measuring rule, a simple strip of marked wood, polished by years of handling, and rest it along the edge. Your thumb anchors it, and with the other hand you take up the scribe, a fine pointed awl that leaves the shallowest whisper of a line. You breathe out and begin. Short marks first, small notches to set the rhythm of the comb's teeth. The marks sit close and even, like the quiet ticks of a steady clock. The teeth must be regular, neither too slender to snap nor so broad they tug at hair. You reckon the spacing by habit now. Once, early on, you tried to measure every gap with a ruler. The combs came out stiff and stingy. Now, your hand counts distance better than numbers do. You score a guiding line along the length to show how deep the cuts will go. The scribe bites just enough to leave a faint, pale track. You tilt the slab and the line shifts from visible to hidden and back again as the light rides over it. For decoration, you take the small bone template you keep tucked under the bench. It is simple, an oval with a scalloped edge, drilled with a few tiny holes for placing marks, and notched to guide a shallow curve. You set it near the spine of the comb, where the band of ornament will sit. The template wobbles slightly. You press it flat with the heel of your hand until it obeys. The scribe follows the scallops one by one, each little bite setting a point that will later be joined by a shallow groove. The pattern is plain. This is island work, made to please without fuss, but even a plain thing can carry quiet handsomeness if the lines are sure. You keep a ragged scrap of linen for rubbing soot along the marks. It is stiff with use, the corners black. You dip it into the small tin where yesterday's sweepings of lampblack and bone dust share the same home, then drag it lightly over the scored places. The pale lines darken at once and stand out against the ivory surface. A little extra soot clings in patches along the undisturbed grain. You wipe it away with the clean side of the cloth until only the lines remain. The effect pleases you, not a bold contrast, just enough to guide a blade when the cutting starts. Your fingers work with an easy patience. The bench creaks in time with your weight, and the window feeds in a slant of light that grows, then dims as a slip of cloud moves over the sun. From outside comes the soft slap of a rope against a post. The sound enters, lingers, and leaves, like a guest who knows the house. A mainstream fact settles in its familiar place. Throughout the 19th century, combs from baleen were common household items across the Atlantic world, prized for their blend of strength and slight spring. Newfoundland's workshops, though small, supplied local needs and fed broader trade through merchants who bundled such goods with salted fish and oil. Your own combs often vanish into crates that travel farther than you ever will. You draw another band of shallow lines, this time a pair of parallel grooves to frame the pattern. The scribe taps, then glides, leaving a pathway your knife will later deepen. When you lean in close, you smell the mild, sweet dryness of scraped baleen, crossed with the faint tang of last night's stove smoke lingering in your sleeves. You listen for the slight rasp the scribe makes. Too loud, and you know you are pressing too hard and risking a splinter. A small, odd practice returns to mind, a quirky tidbit shared by an elderly carver who swore by it. He would moisten his fingertips with a sip of strong tea before tracing patterns, claiming the damp kept soot from smearing and steadied the hand. You tried it once and found no miracle in it, though the faint tannin left a comfortable grip on the tool. Habit wins over lore, but the mind keeps its drawer of little tricks, just in case a morning calls for one. You pause and turn the slab end for end. The future teeth line up in tidy promises. You mark a tiny notch at the center of the spine so the eye will have a quiet resting place when the comb is finished. Combs travel through hands and hair. Your work will be felt more than seen. Still, you want the seeing to be satisfied when it happens. From the shed wall, a mild draft slips through. It lifts a curl of pale shaving from the bench and slides it to the floor, where it joins a scatter of yesterday's remnants. You take your time with the last scallop of the template, making sure the curve meets the next cleanly. Uneven joints turn obvious after polishing, when the sheen reveals what the eye missed in dust. You have learned to imagine the finished gloss while you work the dull surface, the way a boat builder imagines water along a keel even while he planes it dry. You switch to the fine divider, two sharp legs linked by a screw, and tip the points to measure the distance between grooves. The screw turns with a faint grating, worn threads catching and releasing. You set small pricks along the band, marking where a chain of dots will later echo the scallops. Dots are a modest decoration, the kind of embellishment that keeps company with everyday things. You take comfort in modesty that lasts. A low voice out on the wharf mentions a breeze turning, and for a moment you think of sails lifting and the soft give of water against a hull. Then you return to your lines. A question rests at the edge of your attention, one you have no need to answer but that visits now and then. Historians still argue whether outport carvers in places like this mainly copied imported patterns from catalogs and traveling samples, or whether local motifs developed quietly, passed from bench to bench without ever earning a name. You suppose both are true, as mixed as the soot in your tin. What matters at your table is steadiness, curves that meet, teeth that do not quarrel with one another. You finish the band with two small triangles at the ends, a simple way to ground the line. The pattern now stands clear, scallops along the spine, framed by grooves, dotted gently, with the neat forest of teeth waiting below. Later, when you cut between those marks, each narrow space will release a sliver and leave a tooth that narrows to a fine tip. But the cutting can only be as sure as the tracing. Shaky marks become shaky teeth. You press your thumb against the band, feeling the shallow relief that the scribe has raised. It is almost nothing, and yet enough. The light at the window brightens and warms. The mist must be burning off over the water. You rub the surface once more with the soot cloth, deepening the guide marks where they looked faint, softening the rest. Your hands move without hurry, the motion slow enough to feel the tiny catches in the grain. You set the template aside and return the divider to its box, the legs folding together like a patient insect. When you lean back, the comb blank is no longer just a slab. It is a map you can follow with your blades. You turn it a little, let the light walk along the lines, and picture the final polish. A pale, steady glow, the decoration shy rather than bold, the teeth even as the tines of a rake left overnight in dew. You close your eyes and hold the shape in your mind for a breath. Then you set the blank upright in its cradle, ready for the next step. A gull's shadow passes across the window and is gone. The bench smells of soot and oil and soft dust. Your thumb bears a faint gray stain where the cloth rubbed it. You consider whether to begin cutting at once or to mark a second blank while your hand still holds the measure of these lines. You decide to let the mind rest a beat, to let the patterns settle fully. The day is long. The comb will be patient if you are. You choose the place by the window because the light there is honest. It does not flatter or hide. It simply tells you what is present. The pane wavers the world into gentle ripples, warped glass bending the harbor into slow water even when the tide sits still. You pull the bench a hand's width closer, just past the rectangle of sun that lies across the boards. The light is bright enough to find edges, but soft enough not to glare on pale baleen. You set the comb blank in its cradle and settle your elbows, feeling the wood give back a quiet, familiar pressure. The long knife that did the morning's cutting is too blunt a voice for this part. You choose the finer blade, a short, keen thing with a rounded spine and a handle worn satin smooth by hours of the same hold. Your fingers find their places without effort. The grain of baleen runs lengthwise, so your strokes will follow it. You lay the edge just behind the first incised line and take a breath you let out slowly, as if the exhale itself steadies the steel. The first shaving rises like a pale ribbon and falls to the bench with a dry whisper. You pull no faster than the light allows. This is work that rewards pace over force. The knife skims, lifts, rests, and returns. Between each pass you glance at the window to judge the shadow that the shallow groove casts. Too deep and the decorations will look harsh when polished. Too shallow and they will vanish into the shine. You are aiming for the middle quiet, the point where line becomes presence without demanding attention. Outside, the fog has withdrawn to a thin shawl along the water. The masts beyond the glass look straighter where the pane bulges outward, then lean where it pinches in. Your eye learns to read truth through the distortion. A mainstream fact keeps you company. Most small workshops like yours in 19th century Newfoundland worked by available daylight, with whale oil or seal oil lamps reserved for overcast days and winter dusk. Glass panes, often handmade and wavy, were a commonplace luxury that let the day do much of the seeing for you. The sun, cheap and plentiful, is your most reliable co-worker. You move to the scalloped band near the comb's spine. The little template marks left a dotted curve. Now the curve must become a clean hollow. You angle the blade so its shadow lies just inside the line and draw it in a crescent, letting the cut deepen toward the center and lift out again at the far edge. It is the shape of a small breath, another pass, then another, each one thinning the air within the groove, until the curve feels inevitable. The soot in the line darkens beneath your blade and then smears, so you halt, wipe gently with the cloth, and continue. From the lane comes a clack of hooves as someone leads a horse toward the wharf. The sound meets the window glass and softens, then becomes a faint rhythm under your own. You rarely think of time when your hands move like this. The measure comes from the length of a shaving and the way your shoulders lower by the smallest weight as the knife does its work. You set the blade aside and pick up the fine scraper, little more than a sharpened sliver of steel with a burr turned along one edge. Drawn backward, it leaves the most delicate powder, far finer than what a knife would lift. The powder catches the light in a way that pleases you, turning in the air as if undecided about whether to rise or fall. A quirky practice wanders in, one you learned from a traveler who claimed to have seen it in a London shop. He swore that placing a clear bottle of water on the sill would focus the sunlight into a bright oval, a pocket of clarity for the smallest details. You tried it once with a greenish bottle and found the light went strange, too hard at the center and dimmed away at the edges, with a green tint that made every groove look deeper than it was. You set the bottle aside and return to the ordinary sun, which proves, as it often does, that plain things are the best tools. You turn the blank and begin cutting between the teeth marks. This is the part that asks you not to hurry. Each narrow space releases a sliver. Each sliver leaves a tooth. You score down to the line you set in section 6 and stop just shy, letting the final depth come from a second pass rather than a single bold one. The sound changes as the gaps open up, a tiny click as the sliver lets go, and a paper-soft pat as it lands. The bench grows a small, tidy drift of pale slices that slide against one another when you shift your weight. The window gives you what you need. The shadows of the fresh teeth lean to one side now, and you use that tilt to see if any tip sits thicker or thinner than its neighbor. You trim the proud ones and leave the modest ones alone. You imagine hair sliding through them, neither snagged nor escaped, guided but not commanded. The knife does not argue. By the time you reach the middle of the comb, your shoulders have found the easy curve that keeps the neck from stiffening. You roll them once, slow. At the far edge of your hearing, a bell marks something, a boat coming in perhaps, or a signal between crews. Historians still argue whether cod fishing communities and outports adopted formal harbor codes for bells and flags during the century, or relied more on local custom and shouted word along the stages. You don't need the answer to shape a tooth, but the question sits comfortably nearby, like an old friend who visits and leaves you to your work. You set the knife down and test a few of the new teeth with the pad of your thumb. They give just enough. One catches the skin more than the others. You see a tiny burr along its edge, hardly more than a whisper of fiber. The fine file takes care of it in 2 strokes. File, blow, check. The small routines add up to the same plain satisfaction each day. The piece is slowly becoming what it is supposed to be. Light shifts, not brighter, but warmer. The window glosses the bench with a soft gold that makes the baleen look almost honeyed. You know it will pale again when the piece is cleaned, but for now the color pleases the eye. The afternoon will bring stronger contrast and longer shadows that make small faults jump into view. Morning light is forgiving but not blind. You use its mercy to carry you a little farther along the scallops, where each curve meets the next so gently a fingertip will not feel the join. A small draft breathes through the sill and curls a shaving end over end until it comes to rest against the scraper's handle. You leave it there. It looks like a punctuation mark at the edge of a sentence you are still writing. You pull the grooves framing the decoration a shade deeper, just enough that when wax comes later, the lines will hold a soft seam of shadow. You picture the beeswax warming under your thumb, clouding then clearing as it sinks into the work. You glance once more at the harbor through the wavering pane. A boat slides past the corner of your view, first long and thin, then thick and foreshortened as the glass decides its shape. The men aboard are smudged figures, reduced to motion and suggestion. You return to the comb and feel the same reduction at your bench, not in clarity, but in purpose. The world narrows to blade, light, line, and breadth. When the band of scallops is finished, you tilt the comb and let the light run across it. Grooves, dots, frame lines, all present, all quiet. The teeth stand like a pale grove after wind aligned, not stiff. You brush the surface with a clean cloth to lift the soft dust and leave the soot only in the cuts where it belongs. The cloth comes away gray. You fold it to a fresh corner for later and lay the comb back in its cradle. You do not hurry to begin the next phase. You let the morning earn its next step. Your hands rest on the bench, palms flat, feeling the warmth the wood has gathered from the window. The harbor breathes at its own pace. You breathe with it. The knife lies ready, the light steady, the pattern sure. You lift the blade again, find the line again, and draw the next quiet curve as slowly as the day allows. You reach for the small jar of seal oil, its glass sides smudged with the faint prints of many mornings. The lid turns with a tacky pull, and the scent meets you at once, rich, marine, faintly sweet, the way the harbor smells on a still evening when the tide has turned and the water sits heavy. The oil has thickened slightly in the cool air. It clings to the sides of the jar like slow syrup. You dip the corner of a folded linen square into it, letting the fibers drink just enough to darken without dripping. The comb blank waits in its cradle, decoration and teeth now cut but pale, almost chalky. The oil will sink in, deepening the tone, bringing out the gentle stripes that run along the baleen's length. You set the cloth to the surface with the lightest touch and begin to rub in small circles. The first sweep leaves a soft sheen. The second begins to warm in color. The smell rises, more subtle now that it is on the work rather than in the jar. You work along the teeth first, rubbing each one from base to tip so that the oil follows the grain. The cloth catches now and then on a burr. You stop to smooth it with the fine file before continuing. The tips darken slightly, and the light glances off them in the window's beam. A mainstream fact threads through your thoughts. Seal oil, in 19th century Newfoundland, was a staple for lighting, preserving wood, and conditioning materials like leather and baleen. Its ready availability in coastal communities made it as common on the workbench as in the kitchen, though the quality could vary depending on how it was rendered. The cloth leaves a faint tack on your fingers. You pause to flex them, feeling the warmth from the rubbing seep into your skin. Turning the comb, you work along the spine and the scalloped band, the oil settling into the grooves and making their edges sharper without deepening the cuts themselves. Where the soot sits, the oil darkens it further, turning gray to near black in some lines. You take care not to let too much collect in any one place. Excess will harden unevenly. Outside the window, the fog has all but gone, leaving the masts crisp against the pale sky. A boy walks past with a coil of rope slung across his shoulder. Through the waver of glass, his shape bends and straightens with each step, a small ripple of movement in the otherwise still harbor. You continue to work the oil in, slow and even. The comb begins to feel different under your hands, less like raw material, more like something that belongs to daily life. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Some say that if you oil baleen on a cold day, it will absorb more deeply and keep its sheen longer. Others swear the opposite, insisting it must be warm so the pores open. You've tried both and found the truth somewhere in between. The real difference lies in how long and evenly you rub, not in the temperature of the air. Still, on a day like this, with the light steady and the room cool, the oil seems to find its place without argument. You set the comb aside for a moment to work on a second piece, a strip destined to be a corset stay. This one has no decoration, only the need for smoothness and resilience. The oil deepens its pale cream to a muted amber, and you imagine it hidden inside a bodice somewhere far from the smell of the sea, holding shape in the quiet architecture of cloth. Each pass of the cloth leaves the surface warmer to the eye and softer to the touch, though the stiffness within remains. The harbor outside grows a little louder, now a low murmur of voices. The creak of planks underfoot, the hollow knock of wood against wood. Historians still argue whether most small workshops in places like this left their doors open to the street in good weather, letting in visitors and orders as they came, or whether they kept their work behind closed walls until the day's end. You keep yours shut today, the light and the quiet suiting the pace of the work. Returning to the comb, you give it a final rub along the length of its spine. The oil has evened out, the sheen settling into a soft glow rather than a shine. You set it upright in the rack to rest, where it will stay until the surface no longer feels tacky. The smell of seal oil lingers in the air now, layered with the bone dust and the faint salt that seeps through the walls from the harbor. On the bench, the cloth lies folded, one corner dark with oil, another still clean. You will keep it for the next piece, the fibers growing softer with each use. You screw the jar closed and return it to its shelf, where its shadow sits squat and solid in the afternoon light. The tools nearby gleam faintly, their edges turned inward. For a moment you simply sit, elbows on knees, letting your hands hang free. The oil has left them faintly slick, and you rub thumb against forefinger, feeling the slow tack as it lifts. Outside, gulls wheel above the wharf, their shadows slipping over the shed roof. The light in the window has shifted just enough to touch the far corner of the bench, warming the wood where no tools rest. You pick up another unfinished blank, the day's next task waiting without hurry. The jar of oil remains close, the cloth ready. The work will continue, each piece gaining weight and color under your hands, the smell of the harbor woven into every line. You pause before beginning the next cut, leaning slightly toward the open window to listen. The harbor outside is stirring in small ways, a rope tightening on a cleat with a low groan, the faint thud of something heavy set down on damp boards, the gull's calls falling into a slower rhythm. You rest your forearms on the bench and let the sound come to you without chasing it. There is work to do, but there is also this in-between moment when the tools wait and the world hums softly beyond the walls. The comb you oiled earlier sits in the rack, gleaming in a muted way, the surface already beginning to lose its tack. Beside it lies the strip meant for the corset stay, its color now richer than when you first set it down. You find yourself glancing toward them more than you need to, the way one does with bread in the oven, not from worry, but from a quiet satisfaction in watching change happen slowly. Still, the day's rhythm asks for a return to the bench. You take a seat again by the window, this time without a piece of work in your hands. Instead, you let your eyes drift to the view beyond the warped pane. The light is different now, brighter and cooler. The sun has lifted higher, thinning the shadows between the sheds. Out on the wharf, a pair of men roll a barrel along a plank laid over the tide gap. Their boots sound hollow against the wood, a note that carries faintly into your room. You think of the afternoon's work ahead more, cutting, perhaps a repair, perhaps sorting smaller offcuts for decorative trinkets. The offcuts have a way of collecting in boxes, each waiting for a day when there's time to make something small from them. A mainstream fact surfaces. In many 19th century workshops, offcuts of baleen were rarely wasted. Even narrow strips could be shaped into stays for children's clothing, fans, or the stiffeners inside collars. It was a material valued enough to be used until nothing remained but dust. You lean back in your chair and let your gaze drop to the floor, where shavings and dust have already gathered from the morning's work. They are pale, curled, and soft, the airiest evidence of hours spent cutting. Some lie in little arcs, the shape of the blade's motion. Others are almost straight, brittle where the fibers ran short. The broom leans against the far wall, but sweeping now would only clear a space to be filled again before the hour turns. From the harbor, a sound rises, low voices in conversation. The words are blurred by distance and the glass, but the tone is easy, unhurried. One man laughs, a single short note, and then there is the faint clink of metal against wood. You shift slightly on the bench to catch more of it. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Some say that if you listen closely to the voices on the wharf through a pane of wavy glass, they sound as though they are underwater, slowed, bent, made strange by the thickness and unevenness of the pane. You've noticed it yourself more than once, though you've never decided whether it's the glass or simply the harbor's way of speaking. The light in the shed changes as a cloud crosses the sun. The brightness softens, and the space feels smaller, as if the walls have leaned in. You rest your palms on the bench, feeling the faint roughness of wood worn smooth in some places, nicked in others. This is the sort of stillness that does not stop the day but folds it inward for a moment. A faint ringing interrupts not the steady peal of a bell, but a sharper, shorter chime. Perhaps someone striking a metal hook against a post, perhaps a signal to a crew that it is time to move a boat. Historians still argue whether such signals in small ports were improvised daily or part of a known code passed quietly from one generation to the next. Whatever its meaning, it fades as quickly as it came. You lift the comb blank you marked earlier, feeling the weight of it in your hand. The oiling, the cutting, the marking, each step turns raw material into something with a place in the world. You set it down again without working it just yet, letting your fingers rest on the spine. The warmth from the wood beneath it seeps into the baleen, or perhaps the other way around. The harbor's sounds drift in again. A rope tightening, the creak of a mast, a gull's brief call. You realize the gull's voice has been the one constant since morning, sometimes loud, sometimes only a suggestion, but always there. The smell in the shed is layered now. Seal oil's faint sweetness, baleen's dry dust, the sharper salt from outside. You glance at the light one last time before taking up your tools again. The window gives a brighter view now, the cloud having passed. You feel the day asking you to continue. The work waiting in the same quiet way it always does, without impatience, without demand, but with the certainty that it will be done, one steady motion at a time. The crack runs almost the full length of the piece, beginning at one end in a hairline so fine it hides in the grain, widening just enough halfway along to catch a fingernail. You turn it over in your hands, feeling the way the two sides shift ever so slightly against each other when you press near the center. If left as it is, the piece will break the first time it's bent, wasting hours of work. Better to mend it now, while the damage is still patient. You set it flat on the bench, the crack facing up, and gather what's needed. A length of fine brass wire, thin enough to vanish in the surface, a small awl, a pair of pliers, and a tin of glue warmed earlier by the stove's side. The brass gleams faintly in the light from the window, its coils holding the memory of being wound tight. You straighten a short section between your fingers, the metal warming slightly to your touch. The first step is to stop the crack from running farther. You mark 2 points on either side of the widest part. Then press the awl into the baleen with a slow, twisting motion. The hole darkens as the fibers part, and a faint dry scent rises, a sharper edge of the same smell that cutting releases. You make a matching hole on the opposite side of the crack, close enough that the wire will bridge without strain. A mainstream fact comes to you as you work. In the 19th century, baleen was prized not only for its flexibility, but for its ability to hold fastenings like rivets, wire, or stitching without splitting further, a quality that made repairs like this not only possible, but worthwhile. A cracked piece could serve for years once mended, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. You feed the wire through one hole, cross the crack, and guide it through the other. The pliers grip with a familiar, comforting resistance as you pull the wire snug. The two sides of the crack meet again, their edges aligning as if they had only been parted in thought. You twist the wire twice, trim it close, and press the end flat so it will not catch on a sleeve or cloth in future use. From outside, a slow creak sounds, the groaning hinge of a warehouse door swung open after hours closed. The sound comes in uneven bursts, as if the door is being eased against a stubborn wind. You imagine the harbor's air flooding into the dim space beyond, carrying the same layered smells that live in your shed. You brush a thin seam of warm glue along the crack, working it in with the tip of a finger until it fills the hairline. The glue smells faintly of resin and something sweet beneath it, the scent softening as it begins to set. You wipe away the excess with a scrap of cloth, rubbing gently so the surface remains smooth. A quirky tidbit rises in your memory. An old carver once told you he used strands of horsehair instead of wire for certain repairs, claiming they swelled slightly when damp and tightened the joint. You've never tried it, mostly because wire is always at hand, while horsehair, at least in lengths fit for threading, is not. Still, you keep the thought tucked away, should some piece one day demand it. You turn the baleen over and inspect the other side. The crack is barely visible now, only a faint line where the surface's sheen changes. You rub it lightly with a cloth until the color evens out. The wire lies hidden within, doing its quiet work. Historians still argue whether most repairs in workshops like yours were done for the sake of thrift or pride in the craft. You suspect it was both. A good piece of baleen was not easily come by, and no hand who worked it would willingly throw away what could be saved. Besides, there's a kind of satisfaction in giving a damaged thing its use back, a sense of setting it right with the world. The piece will need to rest before you can work it further. You set it aside on the shelf, away from the others, so the glue can cure without the risk of being knocked. The light from the window falls just short of it, leaving it in a quiet shadow. You take a moment to look at it. They're not yet finished, but no longer broken. Outside, the sounds of the harbor go on. The low hum of voices, the distant splash of something dropped into the water, the gull's occasional cry. The day moves forward, and with it, your bench calls you back to the next waiting task. You set the repaired piece aside and choose a narrower strip of baleen from the stack, one just right, for a hair comb meant to rest lightly in someone's hand. It is smooth along one edge, rough along the other, and carries the faint, dry smell that clings to baleen long after the sea has left it. You place it in the cradle on the bench, spine toward you, and run a fingertip along its length, feeling the gentle sway in the grain. The strip flexes a little when you press its ends toward each other, then springs back without complaint. The fine knife is already sharp from earlier, so you reach instead for the divider, two slender legs joined by a brass hinge. You set the points just far enough apart for the teeth you have in mind, then walk them along the length of the comb's edge, each prick marking the start of a cut. The points click softly on the baleen, steady as a heartbeat. You draw a guiding line across the spine with the scribe, then another parallel to it for the decorative band. A mainstream fact drifts through as you work. In the 19th century, hair combs served more than just a practical purpose. In Newfoundland, as elsewhere, they were tokens of care, sometimes given as small gifts between friends or as keepsakes from seafaring men to their families. A carved comb might live in a household for decades, passed quietly from one dressing table to the next. You take up the fine saw and set it against the first mark. The teeth bite gently, each stroke releasing a thin, pale curl that falls to the bench. The rhythm builds, saw lift, the sound like the brushing of coarse cloth. Between cuts you check each gap, making sure the teeth will stand even. A light tap of the file removes any burrs before they have a chance to catch on hair. From outside comes the muffled sound of boots on the planks, steady and close. Someone pauses near the shed wall, speaks a word or two, then moves on. The sound fades into the general murmur of the harbor, where voices mingle with the slap of water against hulls. For the decoration, you pick up a small gouge and begin carving shallow scallops along the spine. The blade arcs gently into the baleen, raising a crescent-shaped shaving with each pass. The pattern emerges slowly, each curve meeting the next in a quiet chain. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Some carvers claim that using a gouge with a slightly uneven edge made the pattern look livelier, as if the scallops had been shaped by hand rather than by perfect measure. You've tried it once and found the irregularity subtle but pleasing, though this morning you stick to the sure, clean curve of your usual tool. The window's light shifts as a small cloud crosses the sun, softening the contrast on the bench. You lean closer, letting your eyes adjust, and continue the band until it meets the far edge. Then you switch to the scraper, drawing it backward along the spine to smooth the cuts. Fine powder gathers at the edge of the bench, clinging to the dark grain of the wood. Historians still argue whether workshops like yours typically produced combs in large batches or worked them one at a time. Some say the rhythm of repeating the same step across dozens of pieces saved time. Others believe that in small ports, the variety of orders meant each comb was made start to finish before the next began. In your own shed, it depends on the day and on whether the foreman wants a crate filled or a single piece finished for a customer's hand. You pause to wipe the comb with a cloth, the surface turning slightly warmer in color as the dust lifts away. The teeth stand like pale pickets in a row, the scallops above them catching the softened light. You tilt the comb in your hand, imagining it polished and ready, the decoration modest but steady. On the far side of the harbor, a gull skims low over the water, its shadow flickering against the sheds before disappearing. You watch it for a breath, then set the comb down beside the others. The bench smells faintly of baleen dust and the oil used earlier, the two scents mingling in a way that feels like the day itself. The next strip waits in the pile, pale and cool under your hand. The work moves forward in its own quiet measure, each piece a small part of the harbor's slow conversation with the sea. You set the finished comb aside and reach for a longer, thinner strip of baleen, one that will become a corset stay. It is light in your hands, yet firm, the kind of piece that will bend with the body but return to its shape when the pressure lifts. The edges are rough from cutting, fibers showing in uneven wisps. You lay it flat on the bench and let your palm rest on it a moment, feeling the coolness before the work begins. First comes the planing. You choose the small block plane with the blade honed fine earlier this morning. The sole glides over the baleen, each pass releasing a faint curl that arcs away and drops soundlessly to the floor. The surface lightens under your strokes, losing the dull gray it carried from storage and revealing the warm, pale tone beneath. You work from one end to the other, keeping the motion steady so no hollow or ridge disturbs the line. A mainstream fact passes through your thoughts as you check the straightness. Corset stays in the 19th century were cut and shaped with remarkable precision, for even a small flaw could cause discomfort or breakage. Whalebone's combination of spring and strength made it ideal, holding the garment's shape while yielding enough for movement. In coastal Newfoundland, stays like this might be destined for local dressmakers or shipped away in crates to distant cities. You turn the strip on its side and plane the edges, removing the last of the frayed fibers. The sound changes a lighter hiss as the blade meets less resistance. You stop now and then to run a fingertip along the length, checking for smoothness. The baleen gives back a faint, dry whisper against your skin. Outside the window, a cart rolls past, its wheels thudding over uneven boards. The noise fades, replaced by the softer rhythm of water lapping against the pilings. You keep your pace with that sound, each stroke of the plane timed as if in quiet conversation with the tide. When the strip is even, you take up the fine scraper to bring the surface to a polish before oiling. The scraper raises a soft powder that drifts down in thin veils, settling on your sleeves. You pause to shake them off, the dust floating briefly in the light before vanishing into the shadows under the bench. A quirky tidbit drifts to mind. Some seamstresses preferred stays cut from the part of the baleen plate closest to the whale's gums, believing it to be more resilient. Others swore the opposite, choosing the outer ends where the fibers were tighter. You've worked both and found little difference, though the stories persist as firmly as the stays themselves. Historians still argue whether stays made in outport workshops were sold directly to merchants who handled all distribution, or if individual makers sometimes dealt privately with traveling traders. The records show both, but not in equal measure, leaving the truth somewhere between the two. Either way, once the stays left your bench, you rarely knew where they would end up, only that they would shape lives far from this harbor. You lift the strip and bend it gently, listening for the faint creak that sometimes comes from deep within the fibers. This one is quiet, its strength even along its length. Satisfied, you reach for the small jar of seal oil and a clean scrap of linen. The first rub darkens the surface, the oil sinking in as if it has been waiting for this moment. You work along the length, then the edges, until the sheen is soft and continuous. The stay now feels different in your hands, warmer, more supple, but still firm. You set it upright with the others, its pale line joining the small standing forest of finished pieces. Outside, the harbor carries on without hurry. The voices are more frequent now, but never loud enough to intrude. On the bench lies another strip, this one shorter, perhaps for a child's bodice or a smaller garment. You rest your hand on it without moving, letting the day decide whether it will be next. The light through the window has shifted again, and the shadows have lengthened just enough to touch the far edge of the bench. You take in the stillness, the faint scent of oil and baleen dust, and the quiet certainty of the work ahead. The next piece waiting is not for function but for ornament, a small offcut of baleen that will become a trinket. You turn it over in your hand, feeling the slight curve it has kept from its place in the whale's mouth. It is no longer than your palm, no thicker than your thumb, and light enough that it barely registers in weight. A scrap to some, but to you it holds the makings of something that can live in a pocket or sit quietly on a shelf. You clear a space on the bench, brushing away the fine dust from the morning's work. The small carving knife is already sharp, its handle worn to fit your grip. You take a piece of charcoal and mark the outline of a figure, a seal perhaps, with its body curved and head lifted, the shape simple enough to suggest rather than declare. The lines are faint, just enough to guide your hand. A mainstream fact settles in as you work. Scrimshaw and small baleen carvings were often made by whalemen during idle hours at sea, traded in ports or given as keepsakes. In Newfoundland, these pieces found their way into homes as curiosities, sometimes even crossing the Atlantic in sailors' pockets. The first cuts are shallow, tracing the outline so the shape begins to rise from the flat. Baleen gives easily under the knife in small work like this, though the fibers sometimes lift at the edges. You smooth them with the scraper as you go, keeping the lines clean. The bench creaks under your leaning weight, and you shift to keep the windows light on the piece. From outside comes the sound of a gull landing on the shed roof, the soft thump followed by the quick scratch of claws on shingles. It stays only a moment before lifting off again, the air above the roofline whirring faintly. You pause to watch its shadow slip across the window before returning to your carving. You work the seal's head first, rounding it with slow passes until the curve feels right under your thumb. The nose is no more than a suggestion, the eyes a pair of pinpricks darkened with soot. A quirky tidbit crosses your thoughts. Some old hands claimed a touch of lamp soot mixed with fish oil made the blackened carvings last longer without fading. You've tried it once, though the smell was sharp enough to make you abandon the experiment after a few hours indoors. Historians still argue whether these small objects were mainly made for sale or for the carver's own amusement. The truth is likely mixed. A quiet evening can produce a carving just as easily as a merchant's order can. For you, the work feels closer to the latter, a way to let the hands keep moving while the mind rests. You deepen the flippers, giving them a slight separation from the body. The knife's tip catches once, pulling up a thin splinter that you smooth away with the fine file. The sound it makes is almost nothing, a faint rasp that vanishes into the shed's stillness. The surface begins to take on a soft shine from handling, your thumb polishing it as you turn it in your palm. Outside, the harbor moves in its usual slow rhythm. A rope tightens somewhere, water knocks against wood, and a voice calls out. Though the words don't carry clearly, you work without looking up, letting the sounds become part of the piece. The seal's body is nearly done now. The curve smooth, the edges softened, so they will not catch on cloth if it is kept in a pocket. You set the knife aside and take up the soot cloth, pressing it lightly into the eye marks and along the shallow lines that suggest whiskers. The black settles into the cuts and the figure takes on a little more life. You rub the rest of the surface clean, leaving only the details darkened. The trinket rests in your hand, small enough to hide in a fist, light enough to forget until you feel it there again. You set it on the shelf beside the repaired piece from earlier. Their shapes and purposes different, but their material the same. The smell of baleen dust still hangs faintly in the air, mingling with the older scent of oil and wood. You lean back for a moment, looking at the clear space on the bench. It will not stay clear for long. The next piece will take it soon enough. For now, the small seal sits quietly, waiting for whoever might one day carry it away from this shed and the harbor beyond. The combs and trinkets rest in their places, but now your hands turn to the batch of corset stays you shaped earlier. Before they can leave the shed, each one must be tested for its spring, that balance between firmness and give that makes the piece worth the work. You take the first from the rack, holding it at each end, and press gently toward the middle. The stay bends in a slow arc, then returns to straight with a quiet resilience. You turn it end to end and try again, listening for the faint creak that sometimes hides in the fibers. This one is silent, obedient. You move down the row, each stay receiving the same measured attention. Some give a little more than others, a few resist until the last moment, snapping back with a faint shiver. You set these aside for garments that need the stiffest structure. The more pliant ones will suit lighter bodices or parts of the garment that move with the wearer. A mainstream fact passes through your thoughts. In the 19th century, baleen's unique combination of flexibility and memory made it the preferred choice for shaping garments, especially corsets. Stays like these could endure months of wear without losing their form, a quality not matched until steel became widely used later in the century. In Newfoundland's smaller workshops, the stays were often sorted by hand into grades before shipping, with no more than the maker's judgment to decide their category. The bench holds a small ruler marked with faint, uneven lines. You use it to check the width of each stay, running your thumb along the edge to feel for any proud spots. When you find one, the fine file comes out, rasping softly until the line runs true again. The filings cling to your fingertips, pale and light as dust from shells. From outside comes the sound of someone whistling not a tune you recognize, but a meandering rise and fall, as if the whistler is thinking more than performing. The sound grows fainter, swallowed by the general hush of the harbor. You bend another stay, the motion slow and deliberate, and watch the light change along its curve. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Some dressmakers believe that stays bent by hand before use learned the wearer's shape faster, becoming more comfortable. Whether true or not, you imagine the wearer's relief at a stay that moves with them rather than against them. The truth of it matters less than the comfort it brings. Historians still argue whether the final testing of stays was always done by the maker, or if merchants sometimes took the task upon themselves after receiving a shipment. The records are sparse. In practice, it may have depended on trust, distance, or the urgency of filling an order. For your part, you would rather send nothing out untested. A failed stay reflects on the hands that shaped it, whether or not the buyer ever learns your name. You finish the row, the tested stays now grouped in small bundles by stiffness. The piles are modest, but they feel complete, each one a small success in its own measure. You bind them with strips of cloth, tying the knots loosely so they can be undone without pulling. The cloth smells faintly of oil from years of contact with fresh-made pieces. The light through the window has thinned again, a hint that the afternoon is passing. The gulls outside sound more restless, as if they know the day is beginning to tilt toward its close. You rest your hands on the bench for a moment, the wood cool beneath your palms, before setting the bundles neatly to one side. The next task will be quieter, still sweeping the fine dust from the floor before it rises with the evening's damp. For now, though, the stays sit ready, each one carrying the shape of your work and the promise of the shape it will one day help to hold. The broom leans where it always does, tucked into the corner beside the door. Its bristles are uneven from years of use, the ends feathered soft where they've worn down against the shed floor. You take it in hand, feeling the slight flex in the handle as you lift it. The pale shavings and dust scattered across the boards seem to have multiplied since morning, fine bone powder mingled with small curls from planing and cutting. You start at the far corner, drawing the broom toward you in slow, steady strokes. The sound is a soft rasp, the bristles catching on rough spots in the wood. Dust rises just enough to blur the edge of the light, then settles again almost at once. You guide it into small piles, each one pale and dry, carrying the faint smell of baleen even now. A mainstream fact surfaces as you work. In many 19th century workshops, sweeping was not only for tidiness, but for collecting useful waste. Baleen dust and fine shavings could be repurposed, mixed with oil for polishing, or even used as filler for small repairs. What others might call scraps, a carver often saw as part of the material's value. You kneel to gather the first pile into a square of cloth, folding it so the dust stays caught inside. Your fingertips come away coated in fine powder that clings in the lines of your skin. You rub them together once, feeling the faint grit before brushing it off on your trousers. Outside, footsteps pass by the door heavier than usual, a slow, deliberate tread. They pause for a moment, as if the walker has turned to look toward the harbor, then move on. The sound fades into the low background hum of the day. You work your way across the shed, the broom strokes forming a quiet rhythm. In one corner, you find a shaving curled so tightly it looks like a pale ring. You set it aside on the windowsill. Perhaps it will join the small box of odd shapes you keep without knowing exactly why. A quirky tidbit returns to mind. An old apprentice once told you he kept such curls in a tin on his windowsill to watch how the light changed their color over months. He swore they took on a faint amber hue in winter and paled again in summer. Historians still argue whether workshops like yours typically maintained a strict cleaning routine or left the floor littered until the work was finished for the week. Some suggest tidiness was a matter of pride. Others point to the sheer volume of shavings in busy seasons as proof that constant cleaning was impractical. Here, you keep to your own rule: sweep often enough that the dust never thickens underfoot, but never so often that it steals time from the work itself. When the last pile is tied into its cloth, you set it on the shelf with the others. The floorboards now show their wear more clearly: dark lines where boots have passed for years, lighter streaks where boards were replaced. The broom rests again in its corner, its bristles faintly dusted no matter how well you shake them out. You stand for a moment, breathing in the quieter air. The scent of baleen is still there, but gentler, mixed with the faint tang of the sea that slips in through the doorframe's cracks. The light has shifted toward the warm gold of late afternoon, stretching shadows from the bench legs across the newly swept floor. Your tools wait in their places, edges turned in, handles lined up. The day has not ended, but it feels lighter now, as if clearing the floor has cleared some small space in the mind as well. You wipe your palms on your trousers, leaving faint marks of dust, and turn back toward the bench, ready to take up the next piece. He arrives the way he always does, halfway between a knock and a scrape, the door easing open just far enough for his cap to appear first. The cap is too big, the brim chewed at one corner, and beneath it, the apprentice's eyes are bright with the sort of attention that tries not to be obvious. He steps inside and closes the door with care, as if the harbor might spill in if he lets it shut too quickly. His boots leave small, damp ovals on the floor you swept a few minutes ago, and he raises one foot as though to apologize for it, then sets it down again without words. You nod toward the bench by the window and gesture for him to come closer. He stands next to you, hands jammed into his sleeves, trying to take up less room than he does. The light breaks over both of you in the same square, catching the dust that floats and settles whenever anyone breathes. You set a comb blank on the cradle, and with the flat of your palm, smooth it once as if calming a small, nervous thing. "Tell me what you see," you say, not as a test but as an invitation. He leans in, brow furrowed, then points to the faint bands that run lengthwise. He calls them grain. You nod, not wrong, not exactly. Even if the word is borrowed from wood, the lines he means are there. A set of subtle shadows, the length of the baleen, the fibers that give it its spring. You slide the blank under his fingers and let him feel the difference between running a thumb along those fibers and across them. Along, smooth, cooperative. Across, stubborn, whispering resistance. A mainstream fact sits comfortably in the moment. Though called whalebone, the pieces on your bench are baleen keratin plates from a whale's mouth, much like the substance of human fingernails and hair. Their fibrous structure makes them both strong and flexible, a useful, quiet paradox at the heart of many 19th century objects. You watch him nod as you say as much, his mouth forming the word keratin silently, as if trying on a new cap for size. You take up the scribe and draw a light line, then another, and pass the tool to him. He holds it awkwardly at first, hand too tight around the handle, the point scraping a little too deep. You don't correct him immediately. Instead, you ask him to listen to the sound the scribe makes when you use it, this soft tick, that shallow whisper, and then to listen to his own stroke. He tries again, lighter, and the sound comes closer to yours. You nod once, an economy that he accepts gladly. Marks lie, you say. If the light is wrong, you shift the cradle until the window glows along the line he scored. The difference is plain now, where the line looks clean, where it feathers. He adjusts without complaint. You show him the template for scallops, let him set it down, watch as he fusses it into place, as if a millimeter mattered, and, in this work, it sometimes does. The harbor makes a few remarks of its own outside a rope thudding against a post, the short mutter of men at a distance, the gulls marking time less often now that the afternoon has grown old. Inside, the bench is its own small school. You put the fine knife in his hand and ask him to draw a shaving from the edge of an offcut. The first pass digs its nose, the second skitters. On the third, the blade finds the angle, and a ribbon rises, pale and obedient, and falls to the table with the quiet of ash. He grins at the sound more than at the shape, As if the ear has learned something the hand already knew, a quirky tidbit slips into the hour. You tell him about an old carver who swore that singing in a low voice steadied the hand, the hum smoothing out the tremor you never notice until a line goes crooked. The apprentice tries it a barely there thread of tune, and the knife's path does seem calmer for as long as he remembers to keep the sound going. When he forgets, the line wobbles, and he laughs under his breath, then starts the hum again. You switch to the file and show him how to remove a burr from a newly cut tooth, 2 strokes, not 3, and never sawing at it as if it were a nail to be worn down. He leans so close his cap almost touches the bench. The file purrs. "Stop," you say, and he does, surprised at how quickly the edge comes true. You remind him that fussing at the same spot is as sure a way to ruin a tooth as rushing the cut. He nods, trying on patience the way earlier he tried on keratin. Both fit a little loose still, but they will tighten. He asks whether the stripes that run the length of the baleen count as real grain. You open your palm and tilt the blank so light rides along it. "Grain is a woodman's word," you tell him, "and we've borrowed it. It tells us enough." Historians still argue whether craftspeople of small outports used their own particular terms for baleen's fiber structure or simply adapted the language already in their hands. The ledgers and letters that survive are too few to settle the matter. You have heard 3 names for the same thing from 3 different teachers, and find that the work answers to all of them, so long as the blade is held right. The day leans farther into afternoon. You ask the apprentice to set the marks for a comb's teeth along the edge of the blank. He counts quietly, pricks with the divider, resets when the spacing runs wide, and does not sigh when you have him start again from the middle. You show him how to hide an error in the symmetry. A hair's breadth extra in 3 places is better than a glaring leap in 1. He files a twitchy burr from a tooth he has just cut and winces, certain he's ruined it, then brightens when the file's second pass sets it straight. "Oil after dust," you say, handing him the soot-stained cloth. He rubs the incised band gently, watching the lines blacken just enough to read. His fingers come away gray. He looks at them the way boys look at new freckles, proud and faintly puzzled by ownership. You give him the jar of seal oil and let him smell it before he uses it. His nose wrinkles, his shoulders drop back into something like respect. He oils a scrap first, then the decorated band, surprised at how quickly the sheen licks along the surface. Outside, a bell gives a single, undecided note. Perhaps a boat rounding the point. Perhaps a signal to a pair of men shifting a crate. The apprentice looks up, then back. The sound no more a command than the gulls or a clock. Inside the shed, the window lays a warm stripe of light across the bench. Dust floats. The knife's back shines where your hand has polished it over the years. You ask him the question you were asked. "What will this become when you're done?" He says a comb, and you tilt your head. He waits, then tries again. An everyday thing, smooth enough not to notice. You make the smallest sound of approval and set your hand on the bench beside his. An everyday thing is the best answer. Most of what matters in a harbor town is made of everyday things that behave themselves. He gathers the shavings into a small pile with the side of his hand. You let him do it, then show him the cloth where you keep the day's finer dust. "Waste is a story we tell when we don't know what to do with what's left," you say. He tucks this away, along with keratin and patience and humming. When he leaves, the door scrapes the way it did when he came in. The room changes size by an inch no more, and the quiet puts itself back together around the space he occupied. You set the apprentice's practice piece near the window to dry. The light catches the faint scallops he cut. They are not perfect, which is a good sign. Perfection belongs to catalogs you've never seen. The harbor prefers steadiness. You sit again, lift your own knife, and return to the comb you left waiting. The blade finds the line with the ease of long habit. The apprentice's hum lingers, even with the door shut. You do not sing, but your breath keeps time. The light has shifted to that late afternoon gold, the kind that lays across the bench in a wide, soft stripe. You turn the comb in your hand so the glow runs along its teeth, checking that each one catches the light evenly. The scalloped band above them looks deeper now, the shadows rich where the curves dip in. You set the comb aside and reach for the long strip meant for parasol ribs work that needs the steadiness of this hour, when the sun is low but still clear. The strip is narrow and straight, the sort that will bend in an elegant arc once fitted into a frame. You lay it flat and measure its length, making small notches where it will be cut to size. The saw's teeth bite cleanly, each short pass releasing a breath of pale dust that drifts toward the window before dropping to the floor. You brush the surface with your palm to feel for any roughness along the cut, then take up the scraper to smooth it. A mainstream fact rests in your thoughts as you work. In the 19th century, parasols were as much a statement of fashion as of function. The baleen ribs beneath their silk or cotton covers were light, flexible, and strong enough to keep their shape through many seasons. In ports like this one, the ribs left in crates bound for milliners' shops, far from the smell of salt water. Outside, the sound of the harbor has softened. The voices are fewer now, and the gulls call less often. The air through the small window is cooler than before, with a trace of seaweed from the tide's turn. You keep your strokes even, the blade whispering along the length of the rib until it feels smooth in every direction. A quirky tidbit returns to mind. Some parasol makers believed ribs from the outer edge of a baleen plate held their curve better than those from the middle, as if the sea itself had trained them to hold an arch. Whether or not it's true, you found those outer strips pleasing to work. The grain is tight, the surface needing little persuasion to lie straight under the scraper. You set the finished rib beside two others and check that they match in length and width. Small differences can strain a frame, so you trim the proud one with a careful pass of the plane. The shavings fall in thin, curled ribbons, catching in the afternoon light like pale threads of spun wool. You gather them into a small pile with the side of your hand before they slip to the floor. Historians still argue whether small workshops like yours shaped parasol ribs to standard sizes for distant buyers or worked from patterns sent by individual milliners. Letters from the time hinted both, but the truth remains blurred, much like the view through the shed's warped glass. For you, the measure is whatever makes the ribs match each other, the set moving as one when the parasol opens. You rub the ribs lightly with seal oil, just enough to darken the pale surface and bring out the faint stripes in the grain. The cloth leaves a soft sheen behind, and your fingers come away with the faint tack of oil. The smell is mild now, the sharper edge having faded from the jar over the course of the day. When the oiling is done, you line the ribs neatly on the bench. The light catches them in a way that makes each look like the slat of a shutter, waiting to swing open. Outside, a small boat drifts past the window's narrow view. The rowers stroke slow and steady, each one sending a faint glimmer across the water. The bench is quieter now, the tools resting in their places. You lean back in your chair for a moment, letting the warmth from the window touch your hands. The work left in the day can wait for a few breaths more. The ribs will hold their shape, the light will hold for a little while longer, and the harbor will keep its slow rhythm just beyond the glass. The warped strip waits on the shelf where you left it earlier, bowed like a shallow smile that refuses to straighten on its own. You take it down and lay it on the bench, pressing the ends gently to see how much it defies the flat. The curve lifts near the middle, no more than the height of your smallest finger, but enough that it would fight any frame or garment it was meant to serve. You turn it to the light, and the bend becomes clearer, the grain's faint stripes deepening where the tension lives. The steaming kettle on the small stove has been speaking to itself for the last few minutes, its lid rattling with a quiet impatience. You set a wooden rack over the stove's side, two crosspieces screwed to a pair of uprights, and place a damp cloth along the slats. The cloth is clean but stained from years of this same work, the marks of past repairs laid out in soft blotches. Steam spills up and threads its way through the wood as if it knows where to go. You hold the strip above the rising breath and let the warmth find it. The first touch of damp makes the baleen darken by a shade, the color deepening like wet sand. You move the piece slowly, front to back, so the heat reaches the bow's highest stubbornness. The smell that rises is gentle, not sharp like boiling oil, not sour like wet wood, more like the mild sweetness of a shell rinsed in warm water. A mainstream fact keeps you company here. In the 19th century, baleen could be reshaped with moisture and heat, its keratin fibers softening just enough to accept a new line. Whalebone, as buyers called it, was often warmed into curves for parasols or straightened for stays, then left to cool under some small persuasion until the new form held. The trick lies in not rushing. A quick scald gives a quick bend that rarely lasts. You test the strip between your palms, It yields a finger width more than it did a minute ago. The bow is ready to be coaxed. On the bench, you set 2 small wooden blocks and a third with a shallow, flattened curve carved into it. The blocks smell faintly of beeswax and oil, the memory of many pieces pressed between them. You center the strip along the curve and lay the arched block over it, matching the bow but reversed, so pressure will meet the resistance in just the right spot. The clamps wait with an open patience iron jaws that have tightened over wood, bone, and baleen for decades. You ease one into position at the near end, the screw turning with a slow, reassuring thread of sound, then a second at the far end, and finally a third over the highest lift of the warp. The metal bites against the blocks, not the baleen, the pressure spreading wide so no ridge prints into the surface. Outside, the harbor has lowered its voice. The late-day quiet has the roundness of a shell held to the ear. You hear less and feel more. Somewhere a line groans as it tightens on a mooring. Elsewhere a board knocks once as if making a polite point. The shed keeps the hush and gives it back in the soft tick of the kettle and the dry whisper of your sleeve as you adjust the clamps. A quirky tidbit floats up while you work. An old carpenter on the next lane once insisted that a handful of sea salt rubbed into damp baleen before clamping would make a stubborn bend submit faster. He claimed the salt remembered the ocean and coaxed the fibers to relax. You tried it once and found only a faint grit left to wipe away later. Still, you liked the story, and sometimes a story does as much good as a tool. Today, you use only water, heat, and time. You check the pressure by sliding a thin sliver of wood under the center block. It meets a steady, even resistance, not a hard refusal, not a weak give. You add one more careful turn to the middle clamp and stop. Too much eagerness leaves a kink. Too little leaves the old bow intact. The kettle sighs and quiets. You lift the lid, let a little steam escape, then set it back. Historians still argue whether outport workshops kept dedicated steam boxes for shaping baleen or relied on kettles, damp cloths, and whatever fixtures were at hand. Inventories list few special contrivances in smaller sheds. Letters and memory point to ingenuity rather than equipment. You have never owned a steam box. The rack, the cloth, the clamps these do for you, because they always have. You leave the strip under pressure and let time shoulder part of the task. While you wait, you oil a knife handle that has gone dry at the butt, rubbing a thin layer into the wood until it drinks its fill. The light from the window reaches farther across the floorboards now, the stripe stretching toward the door. Dust motes drift in that golden path, turning and sinking, as if the air had a tide of its own. After a few minutes, you ease the middle clamp a quarter turn and then tighten it back the same measure, waking the fibers without changing the force. You can feel the warmth still in the blocks. The heat lingers, doing its quiet work inside the curve. You move to the kettle and pour a little water into the small iron pan that sits near the stove mouth, letting a pleasant damp hold in the shed. The room smells clean, faintly marine, the oil and dust pressed back for the moment by steam. Another few minutes pass, measured by the soft ticks of cooling metal and the distant shuffle of feet outside. You loosen the clamps one by one, cautious, as if the strip might spring like a bowstring if startled. The top block lifts. The baleen shows a memory of the old bend, but not the bend itself. The curve is gentler now, almost gone. You lay the piece flat and set a straight edge along it. The light under the rule is the thinnest thread. One more persuasion should do. You warm the cloth again, pass the strip once more through the rising breath, and return it to the blocks. This time, with the center clamp gentler by half a turn. The aim now is not to force, but to remind. A boat outside gives 2 slow knocks against its fender and settles. Your breath mirrors the sound without meaning to. In, out, in, out. When you release the clamps the second time, the strip lies quiet. You turn it over and check the fibers where the curve once resisted. No raised grain, no eased seam, no sign of stress that will return when you look away. The straight edge shows no light now, and your palm, run along the length, tells the plainer truth. It is straight enough for any frame and better than it was when the day began. You lay the piece with its fellows, setting a small, even weight across the ends while it cools completely. The bench looks orderly again, ribs oiled and resting, combs drying to a soft sheen. stays bundled by stiffness, and this once stubborn strip now behaving itself among the straight. You wipe the blocks and hang the damp cloth near the stove, so it will be ready if another warp shows itself tomorrow. The kettle quiets to a low breath. You take a final look at the corrected piece, not for pride but for confirmation that small assent the hands ask for after patient work. The harbor answers in its way, laying a calm along the wharf and painting the window's glass with a deeper gold. The day moves forward by one more measured task, and the bench is the smoother for it. You turn to the next waiting thing, carrying the softness of steam and the logic of clamps with you into the quieter light. The crate leans against the far wall, its lid propped nearby. You drag it to the bench corner, the wood rasping over the floorboards. It is a simple box pine boards, iron nails, a faint whiff of salt in its grain from some past voyage. The inside smells of dry wood and old canvas, a smell that catches faintly in the throat but fades as your nose grows used to it. This one will carry finished work to the merchant. Combs, corset stays, parasol ribs, and a few smaller trinkets to fill the corners. You begin with the bundles of stays, each wrapped in cloth and tied loosely with twine. The cloth is old, frayed at the edges, but clean enough to keep the pieces from rubbing one another in transit. You set them in the bottom, the stiffer ones along one side, the more pliant ones along the other. The separation matters little to the merchant, but it matters to you. The order feels right. Next come the combs. You slip each into a sleeve of paper, folding the edges over so the teeth are protected. A mainstream fact comes to mind as you work. Many 19th century workshops wrapped small finished goods in paper, recycled from old ledgers, newspapers, or catalog pages, both to save expense and because it offered just enough protection for short journeys. Here, the paper is plain and unmarked, torn from larger sheets kept in the cupboard above the bench. The combs make a neat row atop the stays, the paper sleeves whispering softly as you adjust them. You place the parasol ribs in a bundle wrapped with canvas, the cloth smelling faintly of beeswax from earlier work. They fit snugly along the crate's longer side. The trinkets go last, each wrapped in a twist of scrap cloth or tucked into small boxes saved for the purpose. You wedge them into the spaces between the larger bundles, filling the crate so nothing will shift once it is lifted. Outside the window, two men pass carrying a rolled sail, their boots thudding unevenly on the planks. Their voices reach you only as tone, not words, the sound dipping in and out with the wind. You keep working, the crate filling slowly, the interior becoming a small map of the week's labor. A quirky tidbit drifts into memory. An older hand once told you he always placed a shaving of baleen in the corner of every crate, claiming it kept away moisture on the voyage. You've never found proof of it, but you sometimes do it out of habit. Today, you fold a single curled sliver into the corner, not because you expect it to work, but because leaving it there feels like adding your own quiet signature. When the crate is nearly full, you fetch the strips of cloth that will pad the top. They are soft with age, smelling faintly of oil and dust. You lay them over the bundles, tucking them down along the sides so nothing beneath will shift. The lid goes on next, its boards fitting together with a slight creak. Historians still argue whether most goods left outport workshops like yours by ship directly to buyers, or whether they pass through several hands before reaching a final destination. The letters and invoices that survive suggest both happened often. You do not expect to know exactly where this crate will end up. It is enough to know the work will travel farther than you will, carrying something of this bench into another place's everyday life. You take up the hammer and drive the nails in slowly, each strike muffled by the pine. The lid settles into place with a solid finality. You mark the crate's top with a stick of charcoal, the merchant's initials, the date, and the faint outline of a comb scratched in the corner for your own recognition. The mark will likely fade before anyone sees it, but it pleases you to leave it there. When the crate is done, you push it back toward the wall, ready for the cart that will come tomorrow. It sits there quietly, the shape of its contents known only to you. You brush the dust from your hands onto your trousers and glance once more at the bench, already gathering the next day's small scatter of shavings. The harbor beyond the window holds steady in the late light, the tide neither rushing nor retreating. The day moves on, one crate ready, and the work of filling another will follow soon enough. The off-cut box sits under the bench, heavy with scraps too small for combs or stays, but too sound to throw away. You pull it forward, the wood rasping across the floor, and lift the lid. Inside is a pale jumble of shapes, thin slivers curled at the ends, short lengths no longer than a finger, and oddly angled pieces cut away from larger work. Each carries its own memory of the bench, a faint soot mark here, a bit of smoothing there, a groove that began as decoration but never found its place. From this box, you take a handful of the flattest pieces and set them in a small pile on the table. They will serve for practice in scrimshaw, the simple art of scratching images into baleen and darkening the lines with soot or ink. You select a narrow strip and hold it up to the window. The light filters through its thinnest edge, revealing faint fibers within. A mainstream fact settles in your mind as you work. Scrimshaw in Newfoundland was never as widespread as in whaling ports farther south, but it was still known here, especially among men who had served on whaling voyages. Pieces were sometimes traded for goods or given as gifts, their images ranging from ships and sea creatures to flowers, initials, and geometric borders. You fetch the scribe and a small tin of soot mixed with a trace of oil, along with a rag worn soft at the corners. The first piece will be a simple outline of a two-masted schooner, sails half set, the kind often seen in this harbor on a fair day. You begin with the hull, short strokes of the scribe cutting a fine, pale line into the surface. The fibers lift slightly, as they always do at first. From outside comes the clink of a chain being coiled, the sound uneven as it drops into place. You keep your hand steady, finishing the curve of the hull before moving to the masts. A quirky tidbit slips into memory. One old hand told you he always carved ships with the sails furled, claiming it was bad luck to set a wind into something that could not move. You've never minded carving full sails, but the thought still crosses your mind whenever you draw the rigging. The rigging itself is just a set of fine, straight lines, but they require the most care. The scribe catches easily if the hand wavers. You lean close, the point scratching softly, each cut releasing a faint powder that drifts to the bench. When the outline is complete, you dip the rag into the soot mixture and rub it over the surface. The black settles into the cuts, the excess wiping away to leave the image clear against the pale background. Historians still argue whether such work in small ports was seen more as idle pastime or as legitimate trade. Surviving examples suggest both some pieces plain and hurried. Others worked with as much care as any commissioned object. You set the schooner aside and begin another scrap, this one for a simple border pattern that might one day edge a comb or a trinket box. The border is a chain of interlocking curves, each one cut with a steady hand and then darkened with soot. You work without hurry, the bench quiet except for the occasional creak as you shift your weight. A gull cries once outside, its voice sharp in the still air, then fades into the distance. By the time the second piece is done, the light in the window has thinned, taking on the faint amber of evening. You set both pieces on the shelf, not for sale, but to keep reminders of what the hands can do when the main work is finished. The box of offcuts still holds more scraps than you will ever use, but that is its nature. Always ready, always waiting for a spare hour. You slide it back under the bench, the lid closing with a soft knock. The harbor outside is quieter now, the tide turning again. The day's main work is done, but the small work lingers, as it often does, in the shape of these darkened lines and the faint scent of soot that now joins the oil and baleen in the shed's air. The wax has been warming at the edge of the stove all afternoon, in a small tin with a lid dented from years of opening and closing. You lift it now, feeling the faint give in the softened surface, and the smell rises honeyed, clean, with just enough edge to remind you it once lived in a hive. You set the tin on the bench and bring over the combs that have been resting since their oiling. The sheen on them is even and settled, ready for the last finish that will seal the work. You take a scrap of linen, its weave smooth from long use, and fold it into a small pad. The first touch of wax to cloth leaves a pale smear that melts quickly as you work it between your fingers. You draw the cloth along the spine of the first comb, the warmth from your hand and the baleen itself helping the wax sink in. It clouds the surface at first, a milky film, then clears under the pressure of your thumb, leaving behind a quiet glow. A mainstream fact passes through your mind. Beeswax was a common finish in 19th century workshops for wood, leather, and baleen alike. It gave a soft luster and offered protection from damp without the brittle shine of varnish. In coastal towns like this, beeswax often came from small apiaries kept inland. The cakes traded for fish, oil, or goods from the harbor. You work the wax into the teeth next, one by one, the cloth folding itself into narrow ridges to match. Each pass is slow enough to feel the fine tips and catch any last roughness. Now and then, you set the comb back in its cradle to free both hands, working the spine with small, circular motions until the light plays evenly across it. The smell of wax begins to thread into the room, mingling with the baleen's faint sweetness and the low note of seal oil that still lingers from earlier. From outside comes the low scrape of a boat's hull against the wharf, followed by the muffled thud of a rope dropped onto planks. The sound fits easily into the quiet, neither hurrying nor slowing your work. You turn the comb over and begin on the other side. The linen pad now warmed through, leaving the wax soft enough to spread without pressure. A quirky tidbit rises in memory. An old cooper you once knew swore that adding a pinch of finely ground salt to beeswax before polishing would give it a richer sheen and make it resist fingerprints longer. You tried it once and saw no difference, but the story stayed, perhaps because he told it with the same certainty he gave to all his work. You keep to plain wax, finding its honesty enough. Historians still argue whether baleen goods in small ports were routinely polished before sale, or whether this finishing step was a mark of certain makers aiming for a higher price. Surviving pieces suggest a mix, some plainly functional, others treated with a care that went beyond necessity. You polish yours whether they are for a merchant's crate or for a neighbor's order. The finish is as much for you as for the buyer. When the first comb is done, you hold it to the window. The late light catches along the spine and between the teeth, the glow soft rather than bright, the way candlelight plays on well-kept wood. You set it aside and take up the next. The motions repeat, wax to cloth, cloth to baleen, the milky film clearing to a steady gleam. Each piece takes its time, and you let it. By the time the last comb is finished, the cloth is heavy with wax, its edges curling where they have absorbed the warmth. You fold it neatly and set it in the tin for another day. The combs sit in a neat line on the bench, their surfaces catching the thin gold that now angles low through the window. The harbor outside is quieter still, the air cooling as the sun lowers. You imagine the wax setting firm as the night comes on, holding in the work of your hands the way the tide holds the memory of the moon. You rest your palms on the bench, feeling the faint tack where the cloth lay, and breathe in the softened air, a mix of hive and sea and long-worn wood. The lantern hangs from its hook by the window, the glass chimney faintly smudged from the night before. You lift it down and set it on the bench, unscrewing the cap to check the oil. The level is low, but enough for the hours ahead. You fetch the small tin from the shelf, its lid dented in 2 places, and pour with a steady hand until the pool of oil sits just below the rim. The faint smell of it rises sharp at first, then fading to the background note that always seems to linger in a working shed. You trim the wick with a small pair of shears, cutting away the blackened edge from last night's burn. The char falls to the bench in 2 soft flecks. A mainstream fact comes easily. By the 19th century, whale oil remained a common fuel for lamps in coastal communities like this, prized for its steady flame and lack of heavy smoke. In Newfoundland, much of it came from local processing of smaller whales and the parts brought in from larger whaling voyages farther south. You strike the match and touch it to the wick. The flame catches slowly, curling upward with a faint hiss before steadying into a clean, pale light. You replace the glass chimney, watching a brief halo form as the heat begins to rise. The room's corners soften, the pale boards of the wall taking on a warmer hue. Outside, the last of the daylight hangs low, the window's view turning more to reflection than scene. The lantern's light falls across the combs in their neat row, the waxed surfaces taking on a deeper glow. You move it closer to the vise, where a rib waits for the final shaping of its tip. The blade in your hand flashes briefly under the flame. As you pare away a last sliver, the cut smooth and even. The shavings curl tight, each one no wider than a thread. A quirky tidbit surfaces. One older craftsman you knew claimed he could tell the quality of whale oil by the sound it made when burning. He said good oil gave a faint, steady hum, while poor oil popped or hissed. You've never trained your ear to it, but now and then you find yourself listening just to see if he was right. Tonight, the lantern says nothing more than the soft tick of metal warming. Historians still argue whether such small workshops relied entirely on whale oil for lighting, or whether fish oil, seal oil, or early kerosene was more common in later decades. The truth may have depended on season, catch, and what the merchants had brought in from their own voyages. You burn what you can get, and tonight it happens to be good oil, steady and clear. The flame steadies your own movements. You round the rib's tip with small, deliberate strokes, pausing now and then to hold it to the light. The curve comes in slowly, the baleen sheen catching just enough to show where the blade has passed. The quiet in the room is a kind of shelter. Even the faint creak of the bench feels part of the rhythm. When the rib is done, you set it with the others, the bundle now ready to be wrapped in cloth for the merchant's crate. You glance at the lantern and see the chimney beginning to cloud with a faint film. It will need cleaning in the morning, but for now, it casts enough light for the last tasks. Outside, the harbor is nearly black, the shapes of masts and ropes just outlines against the dim sky. The lantern's reflection in the window looks like another flame far out on the water. You watch it for a moment before turning back to the bench, where the tools lie ready for one or two more small tasks before the day ends. The light is steady, the work is steady, and the harbor seems to breathe in time with both. You reach for the cloth, kept folded in the drawer beneath the bench, a square of soft cotton, worn thin enough to slip between the narrowest teeth. The combs you finished earlier have cooled from the waxing, and the surfaces are ready for their final buff. You lift the first one, feeling its weight, light yet certain in the hand, and begin to draw the cloth along its length. The wax, now firm, yields a subtle shine with each pass, a quiet reflection rather than a flash. The motion is unhurried, the cloth folding and unfolding in your fingers as you adjust its edge to reach between the teeth. A mainstream fact rests in your thoughts as you work. Baleen, despite its strength, is not entirely rigid. It will flex under the cloth's pressure, just enough to remind you that it was once part of a living thing, bending in cold waters to strain out the smallest of meals. That spring is part of what makes it so enduring in the objects you shape. You set the first comb aside and take the second. The cloth has warmed slightly from your hands, making the wax release its scent again, a faint, sweet note that drifts into the cooler air of the evening. Outside, a rope thumps gently against a post, the rhythm irregular, guided by the movement of water you cannot quite hear. The window holds only the faintest glow now, the shapes beyond it becoming shadows on shadows. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. There was a man in the next cove who swore by polishing baleen with a mixture of beeswax and a pinch of powdered charcoal, claiming it gave a deeper color and kept away a certain kind of beetle that liked to nest in the wood of comb racks. You never saw proof of either claim, but he kept to it for decades, and his combs did have a darker, richer tone. Historians still argue whether finished baleen items were typically polished to a sheen or left with the soft matte of scraping alone, especially for goods meant for everyday use rather than display. Surviving examples offer both faces, some plain and serviceable, others gleaming enough to catch candlelight at a supper table. Your own preference is for this quiet glow, somewhere between modest and proud. The third comb catches a glint from the lantern as you turn it in your hand, the teeth flashing in a line before settling back into shadow. You work the cloth along the spine, pressing just enough to warm the surface, then finish with a long stroke from end to end. The sound is a soft hiss, not unlike the faint sigh of a small wave drawing back from a pebble beach. By the time you reach the last comb, the cloth has taken on a darker hue from the wax and the light dust of handling. You smooth it flat once more, wanting the cleanest surface for the final passes. The glow it leaves behind on this last piece matches the first even, calm, and without blemish. You set them all in a neat line, their spines aligned, the teeth forming a fine pale fringe against the darker bench. The lantern light falls across them like the last warmth of a setting sun, and for a moment the shed feels as still as the deep water before dawn. You place the cloth back in the drawer, fold by fold, and rest your hands on the bench edge. The work for the day is not yet done, but it has reached that point where the tasks ahead will leave no mark on what has already been finished. By afternoon, the plate has dried enough to carry a faint stiffness when you lift it from its resting place. The light from the window touches its surface in long, narrow streaks, showing the grain with more clarity than in the morning. You set it on the bench and take the long saw from its hook, the teeth fine, meant for slow, even cuts rather than hurry. You measure by habit, not by ruler. The first length will be for comb spines, the second for stays, and the shorter end for the narrow tools requested by the seamstress down the lane. You score the marks lightly with the point of a scribe, the sound more like a whisper than a scratch. The plate rests under your left hand, as if it knows this part is a negotiation between its nature and your intent. A mainstream fact drifts in. 19th century baleen could be cut dry or steamed first, depending on the desired use. Dry cuts kept the edges crisper for small, rigid items like combs, while steamed plates could be bent and shaped for corset stays or umbrella ribs. You will keep today's work dry. The shapes you need want firmness, not bend. The first cut begins with a shallow pass to set the line. The saw's teeth make a muted rasp, the fibers parting in small increments. You do not push. You let the blade travel at its own pace, steady and sure. Shavings, thin as paper, fall close to your hands. You collect them before they drift too far, their curling edges light enough to move at the breath of your motion. A quirky tidbit returns to mind. One old craftsman claimed the sound of sawing baleen would change if rain was coming, growing softer as the air thickened. You never proved it, but now and then you find yourself listening with that thought in your ear. Today the sound stays even, as if the sky has nothing to add. Historians still argue whether coastal workshops used their own patterns for cutting or followed those sent by merchants from larger towns. Some surviving templates suggest a mix, local makers adapting outside designs to the size and shape of the plates they had. You work by patterns passed down through hands rather than paper, the curves and angles learned by repetition, until they fit without measurement. The cut pieces pile in a shallow crate at your feet. The edges are rough for now, marked by the saw's small chatter. You will plane and scrape them smooth later. But first, all the sections must be freed. The plate grows shorter with each pass, its shape shifting from whole to parts without any loss of dignity. Outside, a patch of sunlight moves slowly along the wharf planks, catching the brass edge of a mooring cleat before slipping away. The saw's rhythm is steady enough to feel like part of the harbor's own pulse. The air smells faintly sharper now, the dust of baleen mixing with the salt that drifts in through the half-open door. When the last piece is cut, you stack them in order of use. The comb spines are set nearest the vise, the stays to the side, and the narrow lengths for the seamstress laid flat under a cloth to keep them from warping before delivery. The bench is scattered with fine dust, a pale reminder of the plate's earlier form. You sweep it into a tin kept for such leavings, its bottom already lined with the days before. The saw goes back to its hook, its teeth brushed clean with a strip of coarse cloth. The work has been neither quick nor slow, only as long as the plate required. You glance at the stack and think of the shapes they will take, each one carrying a fraction of the sea into a different room. The harbor outside shifts tone, the tide beginning to turn. You lean on the bench for a moment, listening to it, before reaching for the first spine and setting it into the vise. The day is not done. The first spine sits in the vise with its edge turned toward you, the pale grain of the baleen catching the lantern's low light. You set the scraper at a shallow angle, drawing it toward you in slow, even strokes. Each pass lifts a curl no thicker than thread, the shavings falling into a loose cluster on the bench. The surface beneath grows smoother, the faint ridges left by the saw fading until your fingertips feel only a uniform plane. You turn the piece, working the other edge in the same deliberate rhythm. The sound is a soft, dry hiss, steady enough that it might lull you if you listened without watching. A mainstream fact surfaces. Finely worked baleen in the 19th century could be polished with beeswax to a finish almost indistinguishable from horn. This made it a favored material for personal items like combs, where both durability and appearance mattered. The wax also lent a faint sweetness to the scent, masking the sharper tang of the raw baleen. You reach for the small block of wax kept in the tin by the vise. Its surface bears the marks of years of use, small gouges, smooth hollows, and a deep amber color that speaks of age. You warm it briefly in your palm before rubbing it along the spine. The wax leaves a thin, glossy film, catching in the tiny valleys of the grain before your cloth buffs it to an even sheen. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. One local tale held that a well-waxed comb would sing when drawn through hair on a cold morning, the sound faint and high, like the note from a distant whistle. Whether true or not, customers sometimes asked if a comb would sing, and makers would answer with whatever tone seemed to suit the buyer's mood. Historians still argue whether such waxing was done entirely at the workshop or left for the merchant to finish before sale. Surviving records show examples of both, with some pieces shipped bare to avoid attracting dust in transit, and others fully polished for immediate display. You prefer to finish them here, where the wax can be worked into every edge before the baleen leaves your bench. The spine now gleams with a muted luster, the surface cool and even under your fingers. You set it beside the others already shaped, their darkened edges forming a neat line against the pale wood of the bench. The smell of warm wax lingers faintly in the air, blending with the sharper scent of freshly scraped baleen. Outside, the harbor has settled into the quieter part of the tide, the water moving with less insistence against the pilings. The faint creak of a rope reaches your ear, followed by the brief clap of a loose shutter somewhere down the lane. The sounds fold themselves into the room without disturbing the steady pace of your work. You pick up the second spine, setting it into the vise. The motions repeat scraper, wax, cloth, until it joins the first in the row. Piece by piece, the plate's earlier form fades further from memory, replaced by these smaller, finished lengths. The work is not hurried, nor is it slow. It simply carries itself forward until each task is complete. When the last spine is done, you lay the cloth over the row, pressing it lightly so the edges do not gather dust before morning. The tools are set aside, their edges turned inward as always, the scraper's blade wiped clean before it returns to its place. The light from the lantern rests on the covered shapes, giving them the quiet dignity of work completed but not yet sent out into the world. You lean back, letting the silence hold you for a moment before turning toward the narrow bundle meant for the seamstress. There is still time enough to finish that before the day closes. The narrow bundle for the seamstress lies at the far end of the bench, wrapped in a strip of old sailcloth. You unroll it slowly, the folds releasing a faint scent of tar and salt that has nothing to do with baleen but seems to belong in the room. Inside are the slender lengths you cut the day before light in the hand, straight and still holding a trace of the sea's sheen. These pieces will be shaped into bodice supports and hat frames, tasks that call for both firmness and a certain spring. You select one and set it into the vise, the jaws padded with soft leather to keep the surface from marking. The first step is to round the edges so no sharp line will cut through fabric later. The small scraper works in quiet arcs, shaving away the corners until they soften under your fingertips. A mainstream fact finds its place here. In the 19th century, baleen's combination of strength, flexibility, and light weight made it essential in fashion, especially for corsetry and millinery. Steel would later replace it in many uses, but for decades, baleen was unmatched for pieces that needed to hold shape without snapping. In coastal Newfoundland, a portion of the catch always seemed to find its way into local garments before the rest was sold away. You take up the fine plane, the blade set shallow, and draw it along the length. Thin curls rise and drift down, their edges almost translucent when they catch the light. The piece becomes uniform in thickness, ready to be trimmed to its final length. You cut it clean with the small saw, the sound brisk but muted, and smooth the new end with a few passes of the scraper. A quirky tidbit surfaces from a conversation long ago. An older milliner once swore that hat brims stiffened with local baleen kept their curve better in damp weather than those made with imported steel or reed. She claimed it was because the whales here knew the wet, and so their bones, though not bones at all, behaved better under it. Historians still argue whether such narrow work was often done directly in whalebone workshops or handed to specialized makers. Some accounts suggest that baleen was cut to rough size here and then sent on, while others imply that coastal artisans completed the shaping themselves to increase value before sale. In your shed, the work stays close from start to finish. One by one, the narrow lengths are smoothed, trimmed, and set aside. Their lightness is deceptive. Each holds enough resilience to bend and return without strain. You test one gently between your palms, feeling the give before it springs straight again. It is a quiet satisfaction, not a boast, not a story, just the knowledge that the piece will serve its purpose without complaint. The pile beside you grows. Outside, the harbor has slipped fully into evening. The sky, a flat gray that seems to draw the light inward. The gulls have gone silent for now, replaced by the faint murmur of water against hulls. You work in the steady glow of the lantern, the circle of light holding you apart from the rest of the night. When the last length is finished, you gather them into the sailcloth again, folding it carefully to keep them from shifting. The bundle is tied with a strip of cord, the knot firm but easy to release. It will go to the seamstress tomorrow, and from her hands into garments you may never see. That is the way of it. The work leaves, but a part of it stays here, in the quiet shape of the day. You clear the bench, brushing the fine dust into your palm and tipping it into the tin with the rest. The tools go to their hooks and shelves. The vise is loosened, its jaws left just ajar, ready to hold whatever the next day brings. The lantern's flame leans slightly in a faint draft from the door. You close the latch, then lift the lamp from its hook. The light moves with you across the room, touching the covered spines, the crate of combs, the sailcloth bundle, and finally the bare boards by the door. The smell of wax and salt and baleen lingers in the air, as if the day will not quite let go. You set the lantern down, let your hands rest flat on the bench, and listen to the harbor breathing outside. The work is done. The sea has kept its part in it, and tomorrow it will begin again. The room holds stillness like water in a tide pool, unbroken yet alive in its edges. The lantern's glow has thinned to a soft halo, its light pooling on the bench in a warm oval. Your tools rest in their places, quiet and sure, their edges turned inward as if sleeping. The air smells faintly of beeswax and salt, the scents softened by the cooler night air seeping through the walls. Outside, the harbor has gone dark, but for a few low lights a reflection here. A dim lantern there, each one trembling slightly with the water's movement. The tide has reached its turn. The faint hush of slack water, a rare pause in the harbor's constant voice. A rope knocks lightly against wood somewhere out in the dark, slow and even, like a heartbeat at rest. You lean against the bench and let your gaze follow the shapes the light makes on the floor, the way it turns the grain of the boards into faint waves. Your shoulders ease, your hands uncurl, the day's patterns settling into the quiet between breaths. The harbor, the shed, the tools, all of it, seems to rest in the same rhythm. The flame shifts once more, then steadies. You watch it until the lines between light and shadow blur. The night carries on outside, but here, the day has folded itself away, leaving only the calm weight of work well done. We hope this little journey through time has been a pleasant one for you. If you'd like to hear more, please like, share, or leave a kind comment. And make sure to subscribe, so you'll be here for the next unhurried story from Timeless and Boring. Sweet dreams.